What's going on, guys? Tyler Yasuda here, and Maverick coming at you to talk about bench press and joint stacking. But first, let's talk about technical efficiency. When we say technical efficiency, we're just referring to the relationship between your technique and the amount of weight that you can lift. To simplify this, just imagine if you were testing your 1 rep max, and in this theoretical situation, your muscles are in the same exact condition for every single attempt. That is, fatigue is not a thing, and we produce the same exact amount of force every single time. In this case, the only thing we can change is our technique. So perfect technique would mean that all of the force you produce goes into moving that weight. Anything less efficient than perfect would mean that some of the force you produce gets lost or is wasted, either stabilizing poor positions or on excess movement. In the case of a bench press, our main goal is to lower that bar to our chest, pause in the case of powerlifting competition. If you're training for powerlifting, you would pause, and then push that bar back up to the starting position. Since the majority of that motion is vertical, the most efficient way to perform that movement would be to have most of that force dedicated to pushing that bar vertically away from us. All right, so for demonstration purposes, we have this wooden dowel on top of my desk. The idea here is that if I take this and put it flat on the desk in this vertical orientation, because the center of mass or center of balance is directly in line with this, we're gonna consider this kind of a hinge where it hits the table. But because it's directly in that line, we can leave it here, it'll stay balanced, and it'll stay upright without applying any external load. The only force acting on this right now is gonna be gravity pressing that straight down. Now, if we do the same thing, or if from this position we tip it over, it'll fall, right? At some point, as it leans over, it's gonna get to a tipping point where it's going to fall over. And the more we lean it over, the more it wants to fall over, right? Now, the exception would be if I get my hand, let's say I place 2 fingers down at the bottom where it makes contact with the table. If we're here, if I tip that over a tiny bit and apply some force with my fingers, I can keep it from falling over, right? As I tip it further, of course, it becomes a little bit harder, and at some point, if I tip it over far enough, it's gonna fall anyway. So the point is that the more that bar, or the more that dowel leans over, the more force I have to produce here to support that. Now imagine for a second if this is a terrible idea. Bear with me, guys. After what I assure you was just a brief intermission, we are back now with a collar at the top of this dowel. That collar weighs like 0.8 pounds, so it's decently heavy. The whole point of this is that by adding weight, the same principle applies, it's just gonna be a little bit more exaggerated. So what that means is if everything's balanced, if that dowel is upright and that weight is centered there above this quote unquote hinge, it's gonna stay there. It's gonna stay balanced, it's not gonna fall over. However, because I've added some weight, again, if I put my 2 fingers here, if I start tipping this over, that tipping point, I can hold it here fine, but if I tip it over any more than that, I lose it, right? So with the extra added weight there, the amount of force I have to apply at this axis becomes significantly greater just to make sure that this doesn't fall over. So imagine if instead of this demo, we were watching your press from the side view here, and in this case, that hinge, or where that dowel connects to the table, that's gonna be your elbow. And the vertical is your forearm. The weight at the top approximates the load of the bench or the bar that you have loaded. If you were then to keep that weight stacked directly in line with your elbow, that way it would be quote unquote balanced. However, if you were to stray, let that weight get behind your elbow or forward your elbow, if you lose that alignment, we then have to produce some rotational force if we're here, backward, to prevent that bar from falling over this way, or if we're here, we have to create force this way to prevent the bar from falling onto our face. At the very least, this means that you've wasted some of your available force to keep that bar from tipping over, which is force that you can no longer use to press that bar up away from you. At the worst, maybe you fail your lift. Now, I do want to be clear that this doesn't need to look perfect in practice. While there are a lot of high-level lifters who will nail that joint stacking, just as many will allow for their forearms to tilt just slightly backward as they reach the bottom of their bench. And as you can see here from that position, as long as they're able to flare their elbows just enough to kind of catch and get that joint stacking reestablished before they finish their press, they're gonna be okay. That said, I'd still encourage you to chase the ideal as far as you can, because it's much easier to be consistent if we minimize that extra motion. And consistency of strength is really the name of the game in powerlifting. You realize in competition, you only have 3 attempts, and if you lose one of those attempts due to poor technique, that's already a third of your chances gone. Now, you may have seen some super ridiculously, insanely strong people benching with joint stacking that kind of looks like this. And in that case, I would urge you to look a little bit closer and see if they might be benching in equipment or with a bench shirt especially. We won't go too much into depth, that's kind of complicated, but the mechanics of benching with a bench shirt or fully equipped are very different, so this principle doesn't really apply in the same way. So the main takeaways here are that this principle applies to any free weight pressing movement, whether that be barbell or dumbbells. It could be incline, it could be your regular bench press, incline, decline, overhead press. The only thing that's really changing there is the distribution of load, if it's one barbell versus 2 dumbbells, and the plane of the press in relation to your torso. The direction of gravity doesn't change. Gravity is always pressing that weight down toward earth or toward the floor. So the principle is more or less going to be the same. Now, if you notice that you're struggling with this, if you're watching your film back and you feel like you might be missing some lifts or just struggling more than you should because of poor joint stacking, a couple of my favorite drills to work on are the pause spoto press. I'm sure you can find many demonstrations of this on YouTube, but basically you would come down until you're just about or just short of touching your chest. You're gonna pause there. They usually teach it about 1 inch above your chest. I prefer my lifters to go as close to their chest as they can, so like 1/8 of an inch if you can make that happen. Or if you're in metric, 1 millimeter-ish. Get it close to your chest, pause without touching, and then press away. Having a pause without that support of that touch point means that if you pause with poor stacking, that pause becomes very, very difficult. One of my favorites is the bar drift drill. I've made a separate video about this, which I will link in the description and maybe in an annotation somewhere here. But that's a great way to get familiar with how joint stacking should feel at multiple different checkpoints in your range of motion. Hopefully this information helps you develop your press, whether that's your bench press, overhead press, any other sort of press. If you learned something, please consider liking, subscribing if you haven't already. Those things really do help this channel grow, helps me continue making videos, because YouTube, the way it works now, is basically the more engagement you get, the more they're gonna push that onto newer viewers as well. Anyway, that's all I've got for this one. If you guys have ideas for future videos, feel free to let me know in the comments or message me on Instagram, hit me up on the website, whatever you wanna do, and I will see you guys next time. Peace out, bye.